Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's lecture of Academic Reflections on Liberal Arts Topics. Today, we'll be talking about sustainability and human rights. We'll be discussing these themes through the lens of what is commonly known as social Darwinism. Returning for a moment to last Wednesday's lecture by Professor Hirschbalin, you remember this slide. Sustainability, it was there stated, is a goal of policies guided by human rights. In other words, sustainability and human rights are of necessity tied together, or that at least was the suggestion on this slide. I want to focus in particular on the word dignity as it shows up here. Dignity and living in dignity, and how that is a central concept to democracy. As you remember from last week's lecture, where we talked about Friedrich Hayek, you remember that dignity there came up as well. Even if we didn't specifically mention that word, we talked about how serfdom, or slavery as Hayek describes it, is essentially the condition we live in when we have central planning. Another way to put that is to say that there is no dignity under central planning, at least according to Hayek. You'll recall that according to Hayek, capitalism and democracy were of necessity tied together. Now, with this in mind, with last week's lecture in mind, we can ask a few questions rather about the issues of human rights and sustainability. For example, can contemporary democracies deal with climate change? And is capitalism, in fact, perhaps an obstacle to sustainability? Now, especially this last question will probably not come as a surprise to you. Many of the externalities of, as economists call them, many of the effects of capitalism are in fact very polluting. This, again, is not news to you. What perhaps you haven't considered before is that a dictatorship might be much better suited to actually get us towards sustainability. Think about the discussion of central planning last week. This is one of those pages in the cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom. There, Hayek talked about these planners, and as came up in last Tuesday's Q&A session, one of the students asked, well, who are these planners? A very good question. Now, they can, of course, be government officials, but they also can be, well, basically anyone with a plan. And as you probably know, currently there are many people with different plans to actually create a more sustainable planet and a more sustainable society. But when many people have different plans, it's hard perhaps to see which plan is the best, and the desire for a strong man comes up, as Hayek puts it. We want somebody who can get stuff done. Now, somebody who can get stuff done, the most perhaps obvious example of that kind of person would be a dictator who just says, this is how we're going to do it, and anybody who disagrees gets in trouble. But as a result, things actually get done. So you might say that, well, if sustainability is our main goal, a dictatorship would be the best road towards that goal. This, however, runs into other obvious counterarguments, because there's many reasons, among them human dignity, why we would not want a dictatorship. But this gets us into trouble. Consider the quote you read in last Wednesday's class. There is no primary actor nor a promising political strategy for any significant transformation, and the prevailing and sacrosanct notions of freedom, self-determination, and self-realization are firmly based on the principle of sustained unsustainability. A rather complicated sentence, but a very important one by Bludorn and de Florian. Because note that what they're saying is that these sacrosanct, that is to say, sacrosanct is when something is seen as almost holy, inviolable, right? You cannot break these rules because they're almost sacred. So what do we hold sacred in our society? Well, these notions of freedom, self-determination, and self-realization. These are all essentially those values that Hayek talks about when he talks about liberty. Remember that word at the root of libertarianism, neoliberalism, freedom as the central human value. We want first and foremost to be free. The problem is that since we have these societies now where freedom, self-determination, and self-realization are held as the most important values, these often go at the expense of other people's interests and, of course, the interest of nature, the climate, the planet, etc. Returning then to that notion of dignity that came up on the first slide, there's an assumption here. Namely, the assumption is that we all believe that a life of dignity is a fundamental right. Now, of course, we probably can all agree that it should be, that a life of dignity is a fundamental right, is a human right, that everybody has a right to a life lived in dignity. And that is not just a privilege of the few. However, in fact, if you look at policies, if you look at certain things certain people say, this assumption, this belief that a life of dignity is a fundamental right and therefore a right that everybody has, this assumption is actually not in fact shared by everybody. This is where it's of interest to talk about social Darwinism. You have, of course, heard about Darwinism. Perhaps you've heard about social Darwinism. It is important to state right off the bat that social Darwinism is not scientific. This school of thought has no scientific evidence to support it whatsoever. Now, it is perhaps surprising, therefore, that it remains popular to this day. That is to say, nobody will call him or herself a social Darwinist. It is a term that definitely has a very pejorative association to it today. However, the kind of thinking that you see in the original social Darwinists, we call them that in retrospect, that kind of thinking continues to exist today. And so we'll look at its historical roots in order to have a good image of this kind of thinking, to have a good picture of it, so that we can trace it in exactly today's conversations and discussions. Now, social Darwinists will state that in human society, by which they tend to mean capitalist society, the best entrepreneurs survive. The best business people, or simply they might say, the best people. We'll see how these are interchangeable a little later on. What do they base this claim on? Not very interesting by itself, but it gets more interesting when you see the backdrop against which they have set up this kind of thought. Now, if you look at Darwinism, right, not the social Darwinism, but the actual scientific theory, there it is stated that in nature, those who are the best adapted, that is to say, fit, survive. And it is from this biological theory that the social Darwinists have derived their own frame of thought, right, if we can call it that. So they use biology as a model for human society. Now, this may seem perhaps fairly innocuous, right? We constantly use metaphors from the sciences in order to explain phenomena that don't properly sit within the same field, but we'll see why this is particularly pernicious in this case. In order to understand where social Darwinism comes from, let's first look at actual Darwinism. There he is, Charles Darwin. You've no doubt heard about Darwin. And without going into it too deeply, let's consider his principle of natural selection, because that is exactly the metaphor that the social Darwinists have adopted and applied to human society. So again, in order to get a grip on social Darwinism, we will first look at the theory Darwin proposed. Natural selection, then. You've probably seen a picture like this, the one to the left. All right, there's a population of beetles. The birds like the green beetles. Over time, the few brown beetles that exist can actually flourish because they're not eaten. The green ones are eaten and therefore cannot reproduce. More scientifically put, a few things are at work here. A few things are at work and together combine into what is called natural selection. There's a variation in traits, which simply means that some beetles are green and some are brown. And this is very important for reasons we'll point out in a moment, this is the result of random mutation. In other words, a mutation that these beetles themselves do not control. The beetle doesn't decide to have green or brown offspring. Then there is differential reproduction. Since the environment can't support unlimited population growth, and we'll see why this is important in a moment as well, not all individuals get to reproduce to their full potential. In this example, green beetles tend to get eaten by birds and survive to reproduce less often than brown beetles do. This is obvious, right? You can only reproduce if you are, in fact, alive. Heredity. The surviving brown beetles have brown baby beetles because this trait has a genetic basis. You can only inherit those things genetically that are coded into your genes. What then is the end result? The more advantageous trait, to be brown, right? Advantageous because to be brown means not getting eaten because the birds like green beetles. The more advantageous trait, which allows the beetle to have more offspring, becomes more common in the population. If this process continues, eventually all individuals in the population will be brown. That then is natural selection in a nutshell. Continuing this little Biology 101 refresher from what you probably all learned in high school, it is really important to bear in mind that natural selection is mechanistic and mindless. You should think about it as a process that just goes on like a machine, mechanistically, and that there is no mind controlling this. Now, why do I make a big deal out of this? You remember from an earlier class that we really like to think in terms of patterns. And once you start to think in terms of patterns, it's often tempting to think about a pattern making, somebody who thought it all up, who created it, in this case, perhaps the Christian God. This, however, would be a mistake because natural selection just goes on mindlessly. It doesn't have a particular goal it's working towards, and this is because of that random mutation that I mentioned before. Genes are constantly randomly mutating, resulting sometimes in very beneficial mutations, right? Like in this case, the brown coloration for the beetles, other times in very disadvantageous mutations that will make it harder for you to survive, let alone reproduce. So it's important to bear in mind the randomness of this process. This will be important, as we will see in a moment, because randomness means you do not control it. It's just the luck of the draw. Note also in the end result that the more advantageous trait, right, will help an individual survive. And again, this advantageous trait is not the result of something that individual did. It's really just the luck of being born with a particular kind of genome. Okay, returning to that assumption I mentioned earlier, right? The assumption that we all share this belief that a life of dignity is actually a fundamental right and not just a privilege of the few. What do social Darwinists do? They make survival into a matter of merit, as if it's something that you earned. So making that very concrete in our beetle and bird example, the brown beetles, of course, do not deserve to survive, while the green ones deserve to die. Nor are the brown beetles somehow smarter, right? Oh, very smart of them to be brown. No, they didn't choose this. Random mutation has made them the lucky ones. So for the brown beetle to say that the green beetle is being stupid for being green is clearly absurd. The brown beetles were simply lucky. Survival, in other words, is not a matter of merit. It's not a matter of something you did, it's not something you deserve. It's really a matter, in large part, of luck, at least in this biological framework.